Okay, guys, let's do it. So, Mikey, here you go, the mic.
All right, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Yeah. I'm really excited to be here. It's my first time in Belgrade, so I'm looking forward to seeing the city and seeing what we have to offer. I'm really, really excited. Yes, I know. Well, you have a lot of work to do, so I don't know if you'll have time to show people around, but I'm sure it'll be fine. So, Doc Sorry Didn't Happen is the name of my talk. I want to start by... Okay. So, yeah, it's coming. It's right here. So, why are we here, other than the fact that we want to geek out about technology? Specifically, why are you here at this talk? I'm going to make a few assumptions in good faith, and hopefully it's not totally wrong, is that we want to have more users and contributors to our open source projects. And we believe, or really want to believe, that documentation or any kind of content can help, but something is stopping us from contributing or working on our docs or improving them. So we were discussing this earlier. I'm going to be one of those weird people who does not take on-stage questions. So I believe you said you were going to turn off the monitor so it's not confusing me. We do this at Write the Docs conferences. Write the Docs is a documentation community that I manage. We do not take on-stage questions, but we leave breaks between the talks. And the reason why we do this, and I do this every time I give these talks, is that I want you to come and talk to me. Okay? Most of the questions that we get on stage might not be relevant for everybody in the room. I'd rather spend the whole time giving you some information, maybe inspiring you, and then I'm telling you explicitly, come and talk to me and ask me your questions. Okay? Sometimes when I go to conferences, developer conferences that have sprints, I run a documentation help desk. So I don't know, we don't have sprints here today, this weekend, right? So I am a walking, talking documentation help desk. I'm a communicator. This is my job. I love to have conversations with people. This is how I lose my voice in conferences, but I try to make it work. So please keep your questions, write them down. I mean, I don't know if you can save the questions on Slido, but please come and talk to me. Okay. So, who am I? Why should you listen to me? My name is Mikey again. I am from Israel, but I live in Prague, in Czech Republic. I work for RedHat. I'm writing for OpenStack platform. That's my day job. In addition to that, I'm also on the global core team of Write the Docs. Write the Docs is a community for documentation friendly and people who believe in documentation from all roles. And yes, if it sounds familiar, it was co-founded by the same person who is the co-owner of Read the Docs. So it was started by the same people, Eric Holscher, Eric Redmond. So I work with Eric Holscher and two other people on the global core team. We run events. So we have a conference in Prague, a conference in Portland. I'll talk about it more in a minute. I used to work on OpenShift, containers, and JBoss. I'm a recovering Scrum Master. And I was also a participant in the first ever Django Girls workshop in EuroPython Berlin. Since then I have run a few workshops and helped them out with documentation. Over the course of the last few years. I'm a member of the Django Software Foundation, and I'm a documentation advisor. And I'm also the co-founder of Happiness Packets, which has nothing to do with documentation and everything to do with good vibes in the community. So if you look up happinesspackets.io or Twitter Happiness Packet, because Happiness Packets is too long for Twitter. So that's all the things that I do. And I would like to just kind of give a brief overview of what we have. I'm going to divide this talk into 3 parts. Basically, I want to review some high-level tips and tricks that you can have to improve your open source project documentation. So the first part is content strategy. It might sound like a big, scary term, but it just means think before you write stuff. Plan a little bit ahead. It can save you time. It can save you effort. It can save you aggravation. So I'm going to go through a little bit of that. DevOps for docs. I am a huge fan of tools, even though I don't actually write those, but I work with a lot of people who do. And of course, the tools are meant to get the job done. They're a means to an end. But there's a lot of cool things that we do with documentation that can be integrated into the developer tooling. And the last part is, of course, the community spirit. I love communities. I'm a very big fan of communities. I used to be a community manager for different open source projects, and I'm still a documentation coach for quite a few of them. So how do we help each other and get everything done together in the right vibe? So I would like to welcome all of you in this room to the Documentarian Club. And the documentarian is a word, a term that was meant to define who are the people. It was in the early days of Write the Docs, and we were trying to figure out who we are and who are the people, you know, because everybody was used to more guild-based, old-fashioned technical writing communities. And Write the Docs was something new. And the point was to have a holistic approach to documentation and content. So the official definition from Write the Docs website of a documentarian is someone who cares about documentation and communication in the software industry, regardless of job title. Okay? So what does this mean? This means that if you have any of these jobs, okay, you can still care about documentation. You know, you can be a developer, you can be a QA engineer, you could be a community manager, support. Everybody needs to interact. How many people here need to interact or consume or use documentation as a part of their job? Most of you. How many people here need to write documentation or any kind of content? It could be a README, it could be a blog post as a part of their job. All right, there we go. So most of us have this bidirectional relationship with documentation, right? So we can all care about it, and it doesn't really matter if your official job is technical writer or not. Okay, so content strategy means asking the right questions in advance to save a lot of time later. So originally, content strategy is a marketing term from online marketing and web design. Or you know, most of the engineers that I know say something that happens to other people. But what I love about it is it kind of groups together some practices that can help you really figure out how to make your documentation more useful, right? So the sad joke about technical writing is I write the manual that nobody reads, right? And it's a very sad joke because I really don't want to waste my time writing stuff that nobody reads. So how do I make sure that what I write is useful to someone, that's going to be, you know, searchable, you know, that you can find it, and that you can actually understand it and use it to achieve your goals with the software that we're documenting. So if you are running an open source project, you got to do a little bit of marketing these days, even if you're not actually if you don't actually think that you should, because there are so many open source projects nowadays, there's so many technologies, so many tools, you gotta rise up above the general white noise, right? So how can we be heard above that noise? And how can your content support your mission to take over the world with your library? The way that I see this, and we have different ways to look at it, but what I've discovered as part of, I've been a technical writer for almost 10 years, and for the last 5 years I've been working with open source projects, and I work on big, massive enterprise software library, you know, documentation libraries. I also work on tiny little READMEs, and the basic assumption that I make is I use the methodology of need-to-know docs, which means I don't need to know everything. So how do I figure out what exactly do I need to know? I'm going to be really unoriginal and use the 5W questions to kind of organize the thought process that usually goes into how I plan my documentation and how I see other people doing it. So the first question is, the biggest one is why, right? Like, why do I even need to tell my readers equals users equals possible contributors, right? Depending on who your audience is. Why am I even writing this? How am I helping the users through this content to achieve their goals, okay? So, you know, if you're talking about product integration docs or use case-based or tutorials, you know, like, what is the goal in actually publishing and writing this content? And it puts the whole thing that you're writing in the WIFM test, which is what's in it for me. If I put myself in the user's shoes, okay, and you want me to read this, you want me to spend time reading this, why, okay? And which is interesting, also sometimes it reveals a different issue, which is if I find myself documenting workarounds and limitations around a very specific software area, then it could be that we are basically dealing with a UX problem and not a documentation problem. So as a writer, for example, I found myself quite a few times going back to the designers and the engineers and going, listen, I'm just documenting a bunch of bugs here. Like, maybe you want to go back and fix this so that we don't have to have oh, you know, this piece is broken, but you can do all this other stuff to fix it. And you're like, well, let's just fix it so they don't have to do it, right? So this is the why question. And then the next question for me would be, who needs to know, right? So we're still talking about need to know documentation. So know your audience. Okay, this is probably the next big step that you're going to take. So I document, for example, OpenStack platform. My users are developers. My users are operators, cloud administrators. There's a lot of stuff I can assume that they already know. On the other hand, then this is a conversation I have with engineers at work all the time, is just because your users are developers, it does not mean that they know everything that you do, because they didn't write what you are giving them, okay? And so another sad joke is self-documented code is code that you wrote recently, because in 6 months you're not going to be able to remember it, what you've done, and if you give it to someone else in 6 months, they're going to need to have some kind of onboarding, right? So if we're talking about who is my audience, we can break it up into user personas. We can break it up according to geographical locations, for example. So if different use cases have in North America, in Europe, in Asia, people also consume information in different ways. The most typical audience breakdown is according to personas, which means, let's say, end users, administrators, developers, business users. So it depends on your basic technical skill level and your background. We can divide the information in that way. I'm going to give a lot of examples with screenshots and stuff in a bit. The next question is what? Yeah, okay, what do they need to know? And this is more... this is relevant to the tiny README and also to the big documentation library. You know, so for example, if we're writing a new feature, then we need to explain how it works. Or if you want to go even further and make it even better, you don't just say how the feature works. You say, what can you do with it and where can I use it? So over the last few years, we've gone from comprehensive documentation, which just means here's all the things that our software can do, to here's what you can do with this software to achieve this goal. Okay, so if some of us are using the cockpit analogy where you have the dashboard and all the buttons and everything, and you know your documentation can tell people what every button does. But what you really want to know is how to use this whole thing to get an airplane off the ground. You know, so this is the kind of thinking that you want to do. Do I want to give them just a reference, you know, a checklist, or do I want to actually take them through a process? Okay, and then the next question is, when do the readers need to know this information? So one of the things that I find myself doing a lot when I run a documentation help desk is README cleanups. Okay, README cleanups are one of the most common questions I get from open source projects, because if you go into your GitHub repo or GitLab, whichever your hosting service of choice, and you look at the README, that's like the front page, that's like the entrance to your house, right? And if it's really long and cluttered, people are just going to say, oh, I'm not even gonna go there, you know? So it's like the portal, it's the face of your project, you know? I don't need to tell people so much information when they look at my README. Okay, so README, I treat it like a portal. For example, if you have an error message, you know, you want to make it clear, you want to make it descriptive, but you also don't need to make it like 3 paragraphs long, because the error message, if it's in the terminal, like you're already doing a bunch of different things. You need to balance out how much information you give your readers at any given time so they don't get disoriented and they don't get confused. Okay? So once you figure out these questions, the last question that I would ask is, where do the readers consume this information? So if we're talking, for example, error messages, README on GitHub. Your open source project website is also a type of documentation. I mean, it's, if you're working on more organized open source projects and you have like the actual project website with a hi, how are you, welcome to our project, and then with links to more developer-y topics somewhere else, that's also content, right? And it's like, it's not something that the community managers do. Like, everybody should care about this because different people arrive to information in different ways, right? So you want to consider, what's the platform, the content delivery method that you're going to use? Is it a static site? Is it a wiki? Wiki's not dead, as long as you don't keep killing it. Your readmes, do you need a man page? How do you do your doc strings? And also, please don't forget ease of access and navigation, especially when you're planning static sites, because if you write beautiful documentation and I can't find it, it doesn't exist, right? So you need to publish the content in a place where people can get to it, all right? Stable, all right. So examples, because I love screenshots and live demos never work. And I'm going to give you examples of documentation sites that I like. I can also probably spend another 2 hours giving you documentation examples that I don't like, but I try to keep this talk positive. So I don't want we can digress into horror stories very, very easily. Help.gnome.org, which is not the same as if you just click F1 in your GNOME desktop, and I'll explain why. Because this is a static site, it's publicly available, it does not know who you are, okay? So the first question that it asks you is, who are you, right? Are you a user, administrator, developer? And then based on that, if you click any of these links, then this might look more familiar because it's the same screen. This is the user help, okay? And this is the same screen that you get when you press F1 in your GNOME desktop. Because here it's context sensitive, which means it knows if I'm in the GNOME desktop, I'm using it. Okay, so I will automatically go into the user help, and then you get all the things that you need to do, hopefully all the things that you need to do in your GNOME desktop. This is the administrator section, where it basically just, it assumes that if you're a GNOME administrator, I already know how to change my settings on the desktop and all that stuff. So this is specifically content that's meant for administrators. And the developer center, which you have the application developers, the API references, so it's a very clear separation of user personas. And I really like that. Another example that I like to give is the Arch Linux Wiki. I am not an Arch user, but I play one on TV. And I know quite a few people who love this wiki. Every now and then I get some good feedback on it because Arch users are, does anybody here use Arch? All right, some of you. So Arch Linux Wiki is supposedly favorite. I think you like it, right? I mean, I've heard some good things about it. Why? Because Arch Linux is a highly specialized Linux distribution, and it attracts highly advanced users. And the wiki itself, if you look at it, it's kind of, it's not very sexy looking, right? But it has a really awesome thing called a search box, okay? And the assumption is, when you know your audience, you know that if you're an Arch user and you have to go to the wiki for something, or if you Google, Insight, Arch, Linux Wiki, whatever, then you've already tried everything that you possibly could yourself. Okay, so you don't need to be handheld. You are already frustrated, and you just want to search for this specific problem that you have. So we don't have to make it look super nice. It just has a bunch of links and whatever. But most people will literally use the search. Okay, so it's optimized for the audience who will use it. So I spent about a year working on a project at Red Hat called Minishift, which is a local containerized deployment of OpenShift that you can use for dev and test. And it was a small team inside Red Hat, and I was the only writer, or one of the only two writers, and then the only writer. And what I love about this project is I got to make a lot of decisions. And it was really nice to build a doc set from scratch for a small project and kind of practice doing it right. So this is I don't work on this project anymore, but I checked it recently, and they haven't destroyed the documentation yet, so thank you. This is the README for the Minishift project. Okay, this is what you see when you get on GitHub. And I know it's a small text, but you can still notice that it's short. Okay, it's short. It has a table of content. Somebody told me a few weeks ago, they're like, I've never seen a GitHub README with a table of content. And I said, well, you can do it. So it has the build status, it has a getting started, it has links to the different parts of the documentation, which we then create separately and publish to the OpenShift Minishift site, and it has contribution guidelines. This is the portal to anybody who is interested in using it and contributing to it. And this is another example for when people need to see the content. So we had an error message saying installing, this is for Minishift, installing additional packages is not supported. For more information, see this link. It's not really helpful, right? I mean, when you just say it's not supported, and this was specifically for something of installing packages on the root folder of a VM that you're spinning up. So we can't actually prevent the users from doing that, but if they do it, they can get into trouble. So we can't really say that it's not supported, because not supported means usually that you actually cannot do it. But what we really needed to add here was why this is unsupported and what are the alternatives. Unfortunately, there was a lot of information going into this. We cannot fit it all into one error message. So what we did was we came up with a twofold solution. So we put a basic error message saying why you actually shouldn't do this. So installing additional packages on the root file system might exceed the allocated overlay size and lock the Minishift VM. Proceed with the installation at your own risk. And then for more information, see the troubleshooting guide, okay? In case somebody reads this and doesn't believe us, and they say, no, I really want to find out more information, I'm not buying it. And this is the troubleshooting entry that we had where it says, context, cause, workaround, and then if you have another thing that you wanted to do for it. So we had to split up the information so that the user doesn't get a giant block of text, but also doesn't just see, it's not supported, because that's just not useful. Okay, so now I'm going to jump into the next section, which is DevOps for Docs, which is when we get to geek out about tooling and workflows and processes. I'll do this. The keyword is integration, and everything we do in the documentation world should strive for integration, because silos are just not useful in the long term, and these days you really don't need to work in an isolated environment. So, and we realized quite a long time ago that there's no point in trying to reinvent the wheel when the engineers do a fantastic job at tooling and workflows and processes, right? I mean, DevOps came from the engineering world, content strategy came from the marketing world, and we're just leveraging all of these different things to make better documentation and make the process smoother also for me as a tech writer. So developers already solved a lot of these problems in the way that you manage the code, so why can't I use this for my documentation? So, one of the nice movements in the documentation world is Docs as code. It's not a new thing, but it's getting more streamlined because of the relationships that we build with engineers and the system admins and the people who design these. So this is, again, Minishift. We have a docs folder inside the root of the GitHub repo. So the documentation is stored in the same place as the code. This is better for smaller projects. When you get, and somebody actually asked me this question, if your documentation spans or is relevant for multiple projects or repositories, and you need to publish one set of documentation, it's usually better to store them in their own documentation repository. But most of the time, if it's one code repo, one doc repo, should be fine. And then we have modular source content, so a hierarchical, like this is the breadcrumbs that goes to the like folder structure. So we have the source docs and then a getting started section, and then we have a bunch of topics. And I do believe in writing scroll-free topics. So if I have to scroll, maybe one scroll, okay? But if I write a topic you show it on a web page, if I have to scroll too much, it's too long, you know? So that's what I believe in. I'm a bit extreme in that sense, but I think that as far as attention span is concerned, it's better to have topics that can be self-contained in your computer screen. We have issue tracking is something that I'm always, every now and then I'll go into a new project and I'll see, how do we track documentation bugs, right? So you can tag documentation component, and then you can tag the issues, and then whoever is in charge of writing can deal with it. And you also know that so you have specific documentation related issues. Let's say this documentation is wrong, or you have a change in functionality that created a need for change in documentation. Continuous publication. I remember a time when we had to make CDs with the documentation, and we actually had to stop the press once because things didn't get back from translation on time. That was a little bit scary. But yeah, just like you have continuous delivery, so do we. So we have CI/CD, and there's a bunch of, these are all the markup languages and the publication tools that you can use. If you're using Read the Docs, you're probably quite familiar with Sphinx. Has a lot of automation magic there that I love. And so this is actually the writethedocs.org community website, because of course we will use Sphinx, restructure text, and Read the Docs to publish the Write the Docs documentation. So it's quite fun. We even have previews, website previews, that we can see the website before, during the pull request. Testing automation is hard for documentation because prose does not neatly compile into binaries like code. Right? So how do I do anything more than a spell checker? That's still the hardest part, and I'm trying to follow the trends and see what's going on. So far, there's a couple of things. Hemingway app is quite popular to figure out if your sentences are way too long and complicated. So it can give you an idea. It's better for small bits of text. There's also a test automation framework that a few of my colleagues from RedHat are building, and you basically feed your style guide into it. And it's quite an interesting thing. So you do, this is the balance between, do I build an automation framework or testing framework and maintain it, or do I just test things as I go? We are faced with the same questions as developers. And the last part I want to talk about is, of course, the community spirit. I am here giving you some information. You invited me here. I'm really grateful. I love giving talks for Python and Django communities. It's one of the friendliest communities to documentation people, so thank you for that. So the first thing how do I actually get my communities to adopt documentation is to repeat after me. Docs or it didn't happen. Docs or it didn't. Again. Docs or it didn't happen. Excellent. Thank you. I always said I want to try to do that in the presentation, and I always forget. Yes, PyCon Balkan. Docs or it didn't happen. So, make documentation a requirement, make it a deliverable. These are just some examples. Django project, Linux kernel, OpenStack. If you submit a patch, you got to document it. Even if it's small, you have to write something. So that's the first part. Also, I would recommend to document how to contribute to the documentation. I know it sounds very meta, but if you want to encourage people to write documentation for your project, please help them. Tell them how they can do it. This is something we did with NixOS at a sprint a few years ago, and I think they still have this. So things like, how do I create a topic? How do I build a manual? Depends on what you use for your documentation. Templates are awesome. I love templates, just like you have templates for codes. This is from the this was the Read the Docs, and now it's on the Write the Docs. I think we get the most website hits on this template, the README template. And also come and hang out with some documentarians. This is, we talk about tools and processes and markup languages, but actually it's all about people. And so we have dedicated events for documentation enthusiasts. And you do not have to be a technical writer to come to write the docs. In fact, we welcome people from all across the board, and that's what makes Write the Docs great. Because otherwise we're just preaching to our own choir. You know, we want to collaborate, we want to share knowledge, we want to have a good time. So Write the Docs Open to Help is also another event happens in the States, in Cincinnati, run by a friend of mine, Sean McCants, and they're more sprint focused. So if you have open source documentation, like Mozilla, GNOME, are quite regulars at this event, then you can come and hack on it. And also, like I said, I come to developer events, I talk about documentation, I run help desks, and find me for a chat. I have stickers. I have lots of stickers. This is actually from the Django Girls, first Django Girls at EuroPython 14. I already got them to do a documentation sprint at the end of the workshop. But it was great because we did the tutorial for the first time. So there we've done a lot of problems. Right? So what's the best way to fix the problems in the tutorial that you just tried to do? Contribute back, right? So it became sort of a fluctuating tradition there. And like I said, I run documentation help desks today. And so welcome to the Documentarian Club. I hope you got some information from this, and please come and talk to me. I love to talk about docs and community. And thank you so much again for having me here. Hi, my name is Mikey. I'm a technical writer. I just gave a talk about how to improve your open source documentation, and I'm really happy to be here in the first PyCon Balkan. When I was invited, I immediately said yes because I love PyCons and I love the PyCon community, and I also wanted to make sure that I'm here to support the growing community in the Balkans because I meet them a lot. I live in Czech Republic, we see those people, and I wanted to be able to come here and support the community.